When 9-year-old Lucy Holloway stepped into the dusty main street of Mosquito Flats in 1850, she carried with her the most desperate proposal a child could make. She wasn't looking for a hero. She was looking for a shield. As freight hauler Samuel Morrison reined in his horses, the Arizona sun beating down on his shoulders, he saw only a small girl with fiery red hair and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 hard winters. He had no idea that her next words would force him to confront the ghosts of his own past and choose between the solitary life he'd planned and the family he never knew he was destined to save. Because when a child looks up at you with tear-streaked determination and begs you to marry her dying mother, how do you simply walk away? For Samuel, this question would unravel a dark town, expose a hidden murder, and redefine the very meaning of his own soul. And it all started with a rattlesnake coiled like a living question mark in the middle of the road. The rattlesnake was coiled there, its tail buzzing like angry bees. Samuel pulled hard on his horse's reins, sweat dripping into his eyes, as the snake's black eyes stared right at him, daring him to pass. "Easy there, Thunder," Samuel whispered to his lead horse. His wagon creaked behind him, loaded with medicine bottles that would rattle and break if Thunder spooked. The Arizona Territory in 1854 was no place for a man to lose his cargo. The town of Mosquito Flats lay just ahead, looking like a handful of wooden boxes scattered on the sand. After 3 weeks on the trail, those buildings looked like paradise. But first, he had to deal with this snake. Samuel climbed down his boots, hitting the ground with a soft thud. He reached slowly for the long stick he kept tied to his wagon side. His grandfather had taught him never to kill a snake unless he had to. "They keep the rats away from the grain," the old man used to say. Just as Samuel raised his stick, the snake uncoiled and slithered away into the brush. "Well, I'll be," Samuel muttered, wiping his forehead. Sometimes the desert surprises you with its mercy. He climbed back onto his wagon seat and guided his wagon down the main street. He noticed people stopping to watch him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But something felt wrong. For a town in mining country, Mosquito Flats seemed unusually quiet. He'd heard whispers about this town, whispers about a man named Peterson, who owned more than just buildings. He owned people's fear. "You there? Stop." The voice cracked like a whip. He turned to see a small girl burst into the sunlight, her red hair flying behind her like a copper banner. "Please, mister, don't leave. Shh," she called out. Samuel pulled his horses to a stop. The girl couldn't be more than 9, but her green eyes held the weight of someone much older. "What's the matter, child?" Samuel asked, climbing down. "I need to ask you something important," she said, looking up at him with fierce determination. Behind her in the doorway of a run-down cabin, a woman stood thin as a willow branch. "Lucy." The woman called, her voice a mix of embarrassment and fear. "Come back here this instant." But Lucy planted her feet. "My name's Lucy Holloway," she announced. "What's your name?" "Samuel Morrison," he replied, removing his hat. "Mr. Morrison," Lucy said, taking a deep breath, "would you consider marrying my mama?" The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. His hat tumbled from his fingers, landing in the dust. "Lucy," her mother's voice cracked with horror as she hurried toward them. "I am so sorry, sir. My daughter doesn't understand." "But I do understand," Lucy interrupted. "Mama, you're getting sicker every day. And Mr. Peterson says we have to pay him by Sunday, or we lose our home. If you had a husband, maybe he'd leave us alone." Samuel looked between the two. The woman Margaret Holloway had reached them, and he could see the fever flush in her cheeks. "This Peterson fellow," Samuel said carefully. "He's the one you owe money to." $63, Lucy announced, before her mother could stop her. "And if we can't pay by Sunday, he says we'll have to find another way to settle the debt." The unspoken threat made Samuel's hands curl into fists. A sudden crash of thunder made everyone jump. Dark clouds had gathered, spilling black ink across the sky. "We should get inside before this gets worse," Samuel said. Inside the small cabin, Samuel was struck by the meticulous care. Every surface gleamed. Dried flowers hung from the beams. It was a home built on love, not money. As the rain began to drum against the roof, Margaret told him of the debt of her husband Henry's death and the mine of Peterson's loan. "That's why I asked you to marry Mama," Lucy said, looking directly at Samuel. "I watched you. When your horse stumbled earlier, you patted his neck and spoke kindly to him. Mean men are mean to animals, too." Lightning flashed, and in that harsh light, Samuel saw them faint purple-yellow marks of old bruises on Margaret's left arm. His blood ran cold. "Mrs. Holloway," he said carefully, "has Peterson ever hurt you? He grabbed Mama's arm real hard last week." Lucy's voice cut through the denial. "He said if she couldn't pay with money, maybe she could pay another way." It made Mama cry. Anger, cold and sharp, rose in Samuel's chest. Later that night, after Margaret and a weary Lucy had fallen asleep, he sat on his bedroll, the rhythm of the rain drumming a long-forgotten and somber memory to the surface. He wasn't in Arizona anymore. He was back in the Colorado mountains 10 years ago. He saw his wife, Catherine, shivering under every blanket they owned, her breath a shallow whisper. He remembered begging a wealthy landowner, a man named Sterling, for medicine, only to have the door closed in his face with a cruel taunt. A man who can't provide for his own wife shouldn't have one. When he had returned empty-handed, Catherine was gone. He had run from that ghost ever since. He opened his eyes. He looked at Margaret and Lucy. He saw Peterson not just as a bully, but as the ghost of Sterling, another powerful man preying on the desperate. He had failed then. He would not fail again. The next morning, Harold Peterson filled their doorway without knocking. "I see you have company." His voice was smooth as honey. "I came to discuss Mrs. Holloway's living arrangements." "Actually," Samuel said, standing slowly, "I think Mrs. Holloway's living arrangements are about to change. She has agreed to become my wife." Peterson laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. "Marriage, according to territorial law, her husband takes on all her debts. You have until Sunday, 3 days. Oh, and Morrison accidents happen. I'd hate for your new family to suffer." As Peterson left, Samuel knew he needed allies. But Sheriff Williams, a man with a face like a road map of disappointments, only offered a warning. "You think you're the first one to stand up to him," the sheriff said, telling Samuel of the Fletchers, a family Peterson had systematically ruined. He broke their spirits, and some things are worse than dying. Defeated, Samuel returned to the cabin. Seeing the last hope die in Margaret's eyes, she decided to trust him completely. It's not just about the money, Samuel, huh? She said, pulling a dusty ledger from a loose floorboard. Henry, he and Peterson were partners in the mine. She opened the book. On the last few pages, her husband's notes became frantic. He suspected Peterson was cheating him, Margaret whispered. The week before the accident, Henry told me he was going to confront him. He said he had enough proof right here. Samuel stared at the ledger. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. It was murder. Peterson wasn't collecting a debt. He was burying the last witness. The wedding, Samuel said, his voice hard as iron. We do it Sunday morning. The Sunday morning sun hit Mosquito Flats like a hammer on an anvil. The walk to the church felt like the longest journey Samuel had ever made. The streets were too quiet. As they reached the church, Peterson approached with his men waving a paper. An injunction, he called out. It prevents Mrs. Holloway from entering into any legal contracts, including marriage, until her debt is resolved. All seemed lost. Don't worry, Peterson sneered, crouching to Lucy. As her legal guardian, which the court will grant me tomorrow, I'll take good care of both of you. Samuel felt a white-hot rage, but he was helpless, trapped by the law. But then something unexpected happened. It wasn't Samuel who moved, it was Margaret. The frightened widow was gone. In her place stood Henry Holloway's wife. She stepped forward, holding the worn leather ledger. You want to talk about debts, Harold? Her voice, though quiet, carried across the silent street. Let's talk about the debt you owe my husband. You all think I owe him $63. But he owed my husband his life. They were partners. And Henry found out you were stealing from the mine. He was going to expose you. And then the mine accidentally collapsed on him. She held up the ledger. This is his book, his words, his proof. Peterson lunged for it, but Samuel blocked his path. Then another person moved, Sheriff Williams. He walked slowly forward and stood beside Margaret. Then Mrs. Chen from the laundry. Then a miner. One by one, the people of Mosquito Flats stepped out of the shadows and formed a silent human wall in front of their church. Peterson looked at the faces, no longer full of fear, but of cold, quiet judgment. His power had been built on their silence, and the silence had just been broken. Now Samuel stepped forward, pulling out his heavy leather pouch. The debt stands at $95, he said calmly, counting the gold and silver coins into Peterson's hand. It was a final formal severing of the last chain. Take your money, Samuel said, and leave. Peterson snatched the coins, his face a mask of fury. Without another word, he turned and walked away. He had the money, but he had lost the town. Inside the small, cool church, the air was thick with emotion. You gave him everything. Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. He got money, Samuel said, taking her hand. It felt warm and right. I got a family. I think I got the better deal. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by the brave souls who had stood with them. When Reverend Hayes said, "You may now kiss the bride," Samuel gently cupped Margaret's face and gave her a kiss that wasn't about passion but about promise. It tasted of coffee and dust and the beginning of a new life. Lucy, whooping with joy, threw her arms around both their legs. As they walked out of the church hand in hand into the bright Arizona sun, Samuel Morrison knew his journey was finally over. He hadn't reached California, but he had found his way home. The best adventures, he realized, weren't about reaching a destination. They were about finding the courage to stay, to plant roots, and to build something beautiful with the people who chose to love you back.